Hello, I'm going to use zebras and blinkies to help you to check when you're out in the field that you've got no over or underexposed parts of your image. Zebras, or zebras, where I come from, they're known as stripy horses, or in the local dialect, stripy horses. Zebras in photography enable you to check which parts of an image are above a certain brightness level or being overexposed and blown out. To simplify things, we are going to say that the brightness or exposure of your image runs from 0%, the blackest black, to 100%, the whitest white. If an area is overexposed, then that area will be crushed or blown out to pure white, and any detail in the photo will be lost and you will not be able to recover it in post. Well, what's wrong with that? You may want to overexpose certain parts of your image for certain aesthetic reasons, like videos with skin tones in bright conditions where you want an actor's face to be exposed correctly, but the detail outside through a window is not the priority. But in real life and most photography genres, we are simply not used to seeing things completely white with no detail. Now you can set zebras to display on your camera as a visual aid to show you any areas of your exposure that are over a certain threshold or overexposed and blown out. I usually set the zebras on my camera to appear on any pixels over 109% maximum brightness because I only shoot in RAW format. I'll show you how to set up zebras on the Sony Alpha camera, but most cameras have a similar functionality. As I set up my shot and adjust for the best exposure, I'll keep an eye on my zebras, and if they start to appear, I'll dial back either the aperture, shutter speed, or ISO to back off the zebras, depending on the look of the photo I want to take. This way I know I'm not going to blow out my highlights. Keep in mind though, if you have a scene with a high dynamic range, for example a landscape scene with bright highlights in the sky and dark shadow areas on the ground, you may want to capture several exposures or bracket those exposures and blend them in post-production later, so that you capture all the juicy details in the highlights and all the juicy details in the shadows and really capture a high dynamic range image. Generally, if you shoot in RAW format, you can bring the details up in the shadows in post far better than you can recover the highlights. This is because your photo sites on your camera sensor fill up with light. The bright areas will fill up and overspill with light, whereas the dark areas will sometimes only be half or a quarter full of light. If we were using buckets of filled water as an analogy for your camera's sensor or photo sites. Okay, so I'm talking a lot about the highlights, but what about the dark areas in the shadows? Again, with your eyes, it's fairly normal when you look around to see dark areas with no details whatsoever in the shadows. And this also works in photography too. If you do shoot in RAW, you can bring the details out in the shadows in post far better than you can recover any overexposed highlights. But if you're unsure whether you got the detail in the dark, you can always exposure bracket or check your blinkies. And we'll come on to blinkies shortly. But why use zebras when you have the histogram? You see, I've always been taught to use my histogram, and yes, you should, but zebras and blinkies give you a really quick and easy way to check and judge your exposure. Mainly zebras in RAW for keeping the highlights in check, and then blinkies in the dark areas. But again, there is a catch, which I'll explain when we come onto highlight alerts, or as a lot of photographers call them, blinkies. See, I'll get my exposure between the goalposts of the histogram and edge slightly to the right just before I clip out the highlights, keeping an eye on those zebras appearing on the highlights of the scene. I'll pay attention to the histogram, but then again, I'm not overly concerned about the graph climbing the right-hand side of the goalpost, unless, of course, I'm shooting in JPEG. And if you do shoot in JPEG, just bear in mind, you can't always see the small amount of pixels stacked up against the right of the histogram, especially out in the field with everything else going on. Highlight and low light alerts will show JPEG shooters this. So when I set up zebras to work best for me, I will set the threshold or the point on the image where the zebras start to appear at 109 plus, which is the maximum. As with most sensors, the dynamic range is so good that we won't be blowing out the highlights. I've seen a lot of advice where people are setting the zebras for the highlights at 95%, and I can understand why, as they want to protect those highlights, but the camera won't let you see zebras appear after the highlights have been blown out. Setting your camera to 95% is more of a safety net for JPEG shooters where you blow out your highlights a lot sooner as there is less information or range captured in a JPEG image. Where this method of thinking can come from is the fact that you are seeing the histogram and the high and low light alerts calculated from the JPEG representation of the image and not the raw image off the sensor. Don't worry when you have Zebra's function on and you're seeing the histogram climb up the right hand side of the goalposts. That's just the JPEG calculation. If you don't see zebras in your viewfinder or EVF, your highlights are fine. We are exposing for the highlights and then recovering the shadows in post. When you have a scene with predominantly light tones, maybe just dial the exposure dial up slightly to +1 or more, as the camera may think the scene is too bright overall. Also be aware and be guided by the zebras. Likewise, if you have a scene with generally dark tones, the camera may try to increase the exposure to compensate, thinking that you're in a dark environment. So again, be guided by the zebras, dial back the exposure compensation, expose for the highlights, adjust in post for the shadows. We can see by using this grayscale test chart that only the very brightest areas of the image have zebras. If I reduce the threshold setting on the zebras, then more and more of the test chart gets covered by zebras. And just to mention, this method isn't covering portrait photography or video dealing with exposing skin tones. That's for another video. So I'm just concerned with not blowing out those highlights and then adjusting for the shadows. Exposing for the highlights, adjusting for the shadows later. See, I mentioned earlier about Blinkies, technically highlight and low light alerts. See, there is another little tip for checking that your image is over or underexposed in certain areas, but only on the JPEG version of the photo. This method of checking is somewhat redundant with raw shooting, as we know we have the exposure correct as we have been guided by the zebras. However, again, with the landscape example or a high dynamic range scene, a large area of low light alerts or flashing in the shadows may mean your shadows don't recover well in post. So at this point, decide whether it's worth the risk to lose that detail or to exposure bracket your scene. Again, for JPEG shooters, the LCD or electronic viewfinder is a good way to roughly check that your image is correctly exposed. But in a dark environment, the LCD or EVF can appear quite bright, or if you're in a bright environment, say bright daylight, the LCD can appear to be quite dim. Blinkies instantly alert me to any areas of under or over exposure. One thing to bear in mind is when you do review the photo on your camera, what you're actually looking at is the embedded JPEG image and not the raw file. So if you have a picture profile, say vivid, or anything basically not the standard relatively flat picture profile, you may be seeing Blinkies sooner, where in reality the exposure is fine in the raw version, but always lost for good in the JPEG. Blinkies and zebras are a really good way to check under and over exposure, but experience does go a long way. While we are looking at the JPEG, we should be aware that if you shoot and use the JPEG, then definitely your blinking highlight and low lights are gone for good. If you have minimal blinkies on the darker areas, then you should be okay to recover the shadow detail in the raw file. What we want to do is avoid large areas of blinkies when you review the photo. So we've covered zebras and Blinkies, and I hope it's given you more of an insight into checking your exposure out in the field so you don't get disappointed when you bring your photos home. Thank you for watching. 1, 2, 1. Hello, Hello. Hello, I'm going to use... Hello, I'm going to be using zebras and Blinkies. Hello, I'm going to be showing you zebras and Blinkies. I'm going to be using zebras and Blinkies to show you when you're out into the fuck's sake. Hello, I'm going to be using zebras and Blinkies to help you to check when you're out in the field. Sake. I'm going to be using zebras and blinkies to show you any over or under when you're out in the field. If you have any when you're out in the field, if you have any other when you're out in the field, if you've got any when out in the field that you've got no over or when you're out in the field that you have no over or underexposed sake.